Hello, I'm James Manxlow, CEO of MindTools.com, home to hundreds of free career-boosting tools and resources.
And I'm Amy Carlson from MindTools. How much time do you spend every day reading and writing? Many of us spend quite a bit of our days doing both of these things. And you don't need us to tell you how frustrating and time-consuming it is when you have to read through an email or memo that's poorly written. But how proficient and clear is your own writing? Well, poor writing not only causes delays and frustrations for others, but it can also set back your own career. For instance, your boss may question your skills if you send unclear emails, or poorly written instructions could confuse your team, lowering productivity and causing delays.
If you write well, you're going to make a great impression on the people around you, so it's definitely worth the effort to take the time to hone these skills. The first step to writing clearly is to know your audience. An email written to a trusted team member is going to sound different from an email that you'd send to a new client. Make sure that the tone and the content matches the audience that you're writing for. When you're ready to start writing, think about your audience again. Remember, they have no idea about what you're going to tell them. What do they need to know first? Next, identify your main theme. This is the central point that you want to make. If you're having trouble defining what your theme is, then imagine that you have 15 seconds to explain your point. What would you say?
If you're creating a longer written piece, like a report, then take time to create an outline. This will help you focus your thoughts so that you can lay out information in a logical order. Outlines can also help you make sure that you don't forget an important piece of information. When you write, use simple words. Longer words can be impressive, but they can also confuse and frustrate your readers. Unless you're writing a highly technical piece, stick to simple, clear words. Next, pay attention to the structure of your writing. Long sentences and paragraphs are more difficult to read and understand. Also, use headings, subheadings, and bullet points to break up your message.
Once you've written your piece, go back over it for errors. This is a step that many people skip, but grammatical errors are not only unsightly and confusing, they also make you look unprofessional. So, make sure that you've used commas and apostrophes correctly and that you haven't misused any words. Your last step is to proofread your document again. It's easy to overlook mistakes in our own writing, so it's always worth a second look. You can make sure that your writing flows smoothly and easily by reading your document out loud.
You can find more tips for improving your writing in the article that accompanies this video. You can also learn more on becoming a better writer by going through our bite-sized training session on writing skills.
This is just one of the tools available at MindTools.com. Take a few moments to explore the menus on the left-hand side of this site. The articles you'll find there teach more than 100 skills that will help you improve your career completely for free.
You can also sign up to our free newsletter and receive a skill builder tool every week. When you subscribe from the Writing Skills article, you'll also get a free copy of our Communicate at Your Best workbook, worth $19.99. So sign up now and watch your career take off.
According to ETS, the Educational Testing Service, the TOEIC writing test is designed to measure the ability to use written English to perform communication tasks that are typical to the international workplace. The test is also designed to provide information about the writing ability of test takers across a range of language proficiency levels. The writing test responses are typed and sent to ETS's online scoring network, where they are scored by certified ETS raters. And the writing test tasks are timed, with time being given for preparation and then a specific amount of time to give a response. Now, as we mentioned in previous videos, the TOEIC draws its content from several different areas related to business, daily life, entertainment, and so on, things that you can kind of experience in the business-related environment. And again, much like the speaking test, which we discussed in the previous video series, the writing test is organized in a hierarchical manner. Now, hierarchy means basically that the tasks get more difficult as you go along, and the criteria also becomes more complex. And the tasks are organized to support these particular claims. There are 3 of them about the performance of the test taker. One claim is that they want the test taker to produce well-formed sentences, including using subordination. This can be found in the first task, referred to as write a sentence based on a picture, which is what we're going to discuss in this video. The second claim is that the writer can produce, or the test taker can produce, multi-sentence length text to convey straightforward information, questions, instructions, narratives, and so on. This can be addressed in the second task. Questions 6 through 7 respond to a written text. And the final claim is that the test taker can produce multi-paragraph length text to express complex ideas using, as appropriate, reasons, evidence, and extended explanations. This is addressed in the final writing task, question 8, writing an opinion essay. So again, as we mentioned with the speaking section, the tasks are given a set of evaluation criteria. And as we mentioned earlier, as you move through the different levels from one task to the next, the criteria become more complex and involve items from the task before it as well. So here's the actual chart giving us the detailed information about the evaluation criteria. So once again, you will notice that the criteria does have some changes as you move throughout, but the idea here is that you will notice relevance, which is an idea we'll discuss in a little bit later, will certainly be part of the criteria as you move along. But they're looking specifically at ideas such as grammar, vocabulary, and of course organization. So as we progress through each one, keep in mind that they're still going to keep an eye on criteria that were established even in the first task. So as we go through each video, we'll kind of explore these a little more in depth. So again, to the writing section, I think in general the most important ability is the ability to express yourself. But certain tasks, such as the first task, will also really focus on grammar as well. There's also a kind of an implied idea that we need to be able to comprehend the requirements. So some of these will involve a little bit of reading, not much, but we would have to kind of figure out what the task is asking us to do. So keep in mind, this is somewhat integrated in the sense that you have to read something and then respond to it. You also have to be able to organize your writing. And of course, this is kind of similar to what we saw in the speaking section. Different tasks are going to require different organizations and conventions. So especially in the first task, you will notice grammar is a big part of it. But as we move on through the tasks, there are more complicated conventions we need to follow. And of course, we need to think about grammar knowledge. That will be very important here in this first task. And of course, I think something that's also implied is you have to be able to type proficiently in English. This is not easy for a lot of students, especially if they're not very comfortable typing in English. Now, obviously, you will see that in my experience, for example, punctuation may not necessarily be extremely important, but certainly will play some part in our writing ability. But the idea here is that you have to be able to type in the time that you're given.
Now, in terms of evaluating the response, the first thing you need to recognize is that with the TOEIC writing section, each task is evaluated with a specific set of criteria, which will be explored really more in detail for each video. So in looking at the first task, what you will notice is that grammatical accuracy will play a very important part. Let's go ahead and look at the scoring guide. Now, first off, you will notice that the score response starts with a 3. 3 is considered the highest response. And again, we notice more specifically that on the test, we need to create a response that uses, again, only one sentence. But notice the key here right at the beginning is that it has no grammatical errors. That really is going to be the one of the most important parts of determining your response. So the idea is we have to create a picture that's create a sentence that's consistent with the picture, that uses both of the key words, but really that is the key. No grammatical errors whatsoever. Now, in terms of lower responses, again, for a second response, for a level 2 response, you may have one or more grammatical errors. So the idea here is that to get the highest score, that really is going to be the distinction between the two. Of course, a score of a 1, as you will notice, again, will generally be because you have grammatical errors and you probably are missing one or both of the two words, and perhaps is not even consistent with the picture. So again, just to reiterate, that is going to be the idea here for this particular task. In order to receive a perfect score, you cannot have any grammatical errors at all. So some important things to remember. We have to kind of keep in mind the context of the TOEIC itself. So just like we saw in the speaking section, oftentimes we need to think like a person who is exposed to these particular workplace skills. So sometimes it's beneficial to imagine that you are an employee of this company. We saw this in the speaking task particularly. That oftentimes will help, especially in the second task when you have to respond to a written text. So for example, in that task, you may most likely will have to respond to some sort of email or letter and basically think that you're the employee of that company. In question 8, question 8 is a little more flexible, but it certainly is going to ask you about an opinion involving the workplace in some way. Again, it might also relate to thinking about things that are related to the workplace, such as entertainment, but the idea here is that you will see that they may be asking you questions about attitudes or best practices, or even once in a while workplace ethics. What would you do in a situation? So, to conclude our first part here, as we will see, grammar knowledge, I think, will play a little bit more important role in the writing test than we saw in the speaking test. And to keep in mind that, of course, each section of the test is timed. So really, the idea here is if you're going to accomplish all of the key criteria, it's going to really require good time management skills. You're going to need a lot of practice for these parts of the test. So let's go ahead and begin to look at the first task, and this is involving questions 1 through 5. Now again, you will find below this video a link to the practice speaking and writing questions, and so we'll be referencing those throughout the video. So again, let's go ahead and look at the requirements here, the task itself. In this part of the test, you will write one sentence that is based on a picture. With each picture, you will be given 2 words or phrases that you must use in your sentence. You can change the forms of the words, and you can use the words in any order. Your sentence will be scored on the appropriate use of grammar and the relevance of the sentence to the picture. In this part, you can move to the next question by clicking on Next. If you want to return to a previous question, click on Back. You will have 8 minutes to complete this part of the test. So, here's the sample picture and the 2 words below, airport terminal and so. So what do we notice so far? Well, according to the requirements, we have 8 minutes to complete all of the writing tasks. And the picture, of course, is essential in determining the relevance of the response. So we can't just construct any sentence, we have to consider what's going on in the picture. And we're given 2 words under the picture, and we must demonstrate how to use these words by looking at the picture. Now, of course, this brings us to our first kind of trick, and that's the idea of relevance. What exactly do they mean by relevance in this particular context? So what I want you to think of first is the picture, and this is something similar we saw in the listening section, where you were given a photo and had to kind of really think about what's going on in the picture right now. And that's important, because the picture itself is kind of depicting sort of like a window into what's going on. So the idea here is the task is not asking you to describe the general or basic idea of an airport, but to think about what is happening at the airport at this moment. That's important. Again, the picture is not just telling you that we're at an airport, but it's actually what's happening at the airport at the moment. So this is what they mean by relevance. It's not just anything in the photo that relates to it. So, of course, we need to know what happens at an airport in general. That's certainly important. But the reason the TOEIC has given you this picture is because they want this specific picture at this specific part of the airport at this specific time. Now we're going to look at the picture again. Now right now we're going to remove the 2 words, and we're just going to think about the picture as what's going on in the picture right now. In other words, what's relevant in the photo.
So as we look at the picture, let's think about for a moment, what are things we see in the picture? What do you think is relevant about it? Well, just by looking, we do see that there happens to be a line of cars, probably either waiting to pick up or drop off passengers. We do see some people leaving, perhaps waiting for taxis or waiting for their rides. This lady here on the sidewalk looked like maybe she's hailing a cab or waving to someone she knows. As we look at the actual road next to the airport, notice we also see some cars. Looks like this might be a taxi driving on the road itself. I see perhaps a shuttle that's heading out as well. It also looks to be about maybe either the morning or the afternoon. Daylight, it certainly appears to be. So again, thinking about what's relevant. So we discussed some of them. Here are 6 things that I think we can kind of simplify. So it is an airport terminal for arrivals. Again, most likely these people are waiting for someone. It does appear to be extremely busy, at least in terms of the cars, though I wouldn't necessarily say it's extremely busy in terms of people. Cars are lined up in the loading zone. People are waiting to pick up passengers. There's that woman, again, hailing a taxi or signaling to a car. And some people at the door are leaving with their luggage. Now, so again, there are lots of things we could kind of point out. So now let's think about which choices seem to describe what is mainly going on in the picture. Obviously, we could spend a lot of time describing details, but which ones do you think actually describe as to what the main purpose of this picture is? Well, let's pull out our pen tool for a moment. For example, an airport terminal for arrivals. Well, that may be relevant. In fact, that does seem to kind of connect to number 3 and number 4. Again, when I think about the main idea of the picture, I'm not sure the woman herself is actually the main idea of the photo, so I'll probably eliminate this one. Also, I don't know necessarily that some people leaving with their luggage refers to the main idea. Again, the TOEIC usually constructs these photos for a particular reason. So when I think about the main idea of the photo, I definitely think about the fact that it seems to be our attention is focusing on the fact that there are people who seem to be leaving, mainly because they were picking up passengers to leave, because they were arriving. So again, when I think about it, I think 1, 3, and 4 seem to kind of relate to what's relevant about the photo at the moment. So now let's return to the 2 words we were given. So now we have airport terminal and so. So really the key is to think about, from the ones we addressed over here, 1, 3, and 4, how can we somehow figure out how to connect these 2 words to what's relevant about the photo? Well, this brings us to our next discussion, and that is exactly thinking about those 2 words. What are their parts of speech, and what type of relationships do they have? Now, we're not going to go in great detail about parts of speech here in this video. I would certainly recommend that you might want to check out our Intro to Grammar video series if you want to know more about the basic parts of speech. But the idea here is that the 2 words you're given are not always going to be so obvious. In fact, sometimes you may be given what we call a support or function word and then 1 content word. So let's explore those ideas a little more in detail. So first off, let's look at a support word. And again, we also call it a function word, but I'm going to use the word support word. Support words generally fall into these categories. Connectors, so for example, words such as and, so, or but. Subordinating clause words, such as adverb, adjective, or noun clause connectors. Words such as which, that, who, while, whereas. Prepositions can also serve as support words. Words such as from, for, or to. Or even transition or opposition words such as whenever or however. So don't be surprised if one of the words you're given comes from these particular categories. Now we need to note that as you progress through this particular task, recall that there are 5 questions. Well, questions 4 and 5 will use a subordinating clause word, so you will see either an adjective, adverb, or noun connector as one of the words. So you need to be prepared that for those 2 questions, you definitely might want to take time to study more about subordinating clauses. Now let's discuss content words. On the other hand, content words are generally those words we think of as the more important ideas in language. So, for example, nouns, such as airport terminal, a flower, for example. Verbs, like the verb hit or walk. Adjectives, busy or difficult. And generally these are the three that they use on the test. Now, an adverb could also be considered a content word, but you probably won't see an adverb as one of the choices. It's possible, but again, most likely it'll come from one of these three. So thinking about the objective, we have to be able to immediately identify the part of speech for each word. And if you can't identify the exact part of speech, then try to focus on what the words do in a sentence. So again, if you can't necessarily recognize it's an adjective or adverb, think about a sample idea. Use the word in a sample sentence, and that might give you an idea of how to use it in your example. Of course, remember, questions 4 or 5 will involve a subordinator. So really, this task is looking at your ability to understand grammar and how words relate to each other. So not only do we have to think about how the ideas or words relate to the picture, we've got to put them together in a grammatically correct way. And that's very important for this part of the test. The second part about it is also to think about how the words relate to each other. And as we said before, they have to be able to relate to what's in the picture. So chances are there could be, and this is important, many possible answers, including the possibility of changing the order of the words. So don't just be trapped into thinking that I have to use them in the order they're given. I can change the order if I wish. So again, for airport terminal and so, I could easily use so in the first part and airport terminal second. But in this case, let's think more about just the words themselves. So first off, which one is the support word and which one is the content word? Well, airport terminal in this case would be considered the content word. It's a noun. So, on the other hand, would be most likely considered the support word. Now notice, though, it has different meanings and different uses. You could use it, of course, as a coordinate connector. That's a fairly common one. And, but, or so are examples of coordinate connectors. You could use it as part of an adverbial connector, so that. Or you could also use it as an adverbial intensifier to intensify an adjective like hungry. So for example, I'm so hungry. So there could be more than one possible use for this word. Now we also need to think, again, how do they relate to each other while also conveying what's relevant in the picture. So now I'm going to give you just a few minutes. I want you to think about coming up with a few possible answers. And remember, you can only write one sentence using these words on the test. But here, as we're practicing, I want you to think about a few possible answers. So maybe take a moment and pause the video and take a piece of paper and see if you can write a couple of examples. When you're ready, come back and then we'll see comparing to some of the examples that I came up with. So, let's take a look now and thinking about what they're looking for. Again, the idea here I think is very important. Grammatical accuracy is certainly going to be a priority. We cannot make any grammatical mistakes. And we need appropriate word order and form. And of course the response has to be logical. It also has to relate to what's going on in the picture. So think about, is what I'm writing relating to what's in the picture? And of course I think it also needs to be what's important in the picture as well. Not just something typical or ordinary. And of course the words and grammatical structures, are they appropriate for this particular photo? So again, you're using other words too, so make sure that they are also appropriate. Now I think it's also important to think, what are they not looking for? Well, I don't think they're necessarily looking for big vocabulary words or ideas. Certainly you could use good vocabulary, and I think that's important, but I don't think that's necessarily the focus of this particular activity. Using complex or high-level vocabulary is probably not going to get you necessarily a better score. But I think vocabulary that's appropriate will be. So again, we want to make sure we're using words that seem to relate to the picture. Now, some students might think that that is difficult or high-level vocabulary. But I think in this case, they want to make sure that it's appropriate for the context. So for example, when I said at the airport, the loading zone, you might think of that as a high-level vocabulary word, but it really isn't that high level. It's just a word that's very particular to being at an airport. So again, thinking about other ways to construct an answer. We're focusing on the now. If you recall, we said think of it as a window into what's going on right now. So oftentimes I encourage students to try to use the present progressive when you're constructing your sentence, because it gives a sense that the idea is happening at this moment. Now, of course, that's not always necessary. Certainly, the sentence itself may not necessarily need an action. But if you're going to use an action, think about these following things. Present progressive, or if we're describing a thing instead of a person, then sometimes we might even use the passive voice. Perhaps using a passive adjective, or using be plus an ed participle to emphasize that something has just happened before the picture was taken. So again, these are two kind of suggestions when it comes to constructing a response. So now let's think about some sample responses. Let's take a look at some of the ones I came up with. Cars are arriving at the airport terminal so that they can pick up passengers. Cars are lined up outside of the airport terminal so that they can pick up arriving passengers. So notice I used here arriving as in an active voice sense, but then I also use cars are lined up. This is kind of a passive voice sense. Now, of course, notice how I use airport terminal and so. I decided to keep it in the same order. Now, keep in mind, you don't have to put them right next to each other. That's not a requirement of the response. Here's another sample. The airport terminal is so busy right now that cars are lining up to pick up arriving passengers. Of course, these are just some of the ones that I came up with. And keep in mind, we could certainly have written more. But the idea is we only need one. And we need to make sure that as we write our responses that they appear to be, again, grammatically accurate. That's important. Now, of course, you don't have to make your sentences this long, but as the responses or as the words become a little bit more difficult, you probably do need to consider including more information. Now, maybe you came up with some other answers or responses as well. And again, recall that you can switch the word so and airport terminal. But these are just some of the ones I came up with.
Now, our final discussion point of this video is to think about that on this particular part of the test, there really is no incentive to create difficult answers. So the final piece of advice I'm going to give to you is to keep it simple. The important thing to understand here is that with this part of the test, the TOEIC is not evaluating your ability to express yourself. So in other words, using vocabulary is important, but it doesn't necessarily have to be very complex to get a good score. And in fact, the thing I really want to stress here is if you try to get too ambitious with your response, you might run the risk of making a grammatical mistake. Obviously, the longer your response is, the greater chance you have of being wrong with a particular grammatical error. So the last thing I'm going to share here is it might be a good idea to think about keeping your response simple and to the point. So again, looking at all of the different choices I created, you might think these are probably a little too long, and I think that might be true. Certainly we can come up with longer answers and come up with more interesting answers, but really the ultimate idea here is we still just have to use these two words in a grammatically correct way. So could we come up with a simpler response that would still be grammatically accurate and relevant? Well, for example, in number 3, I mentioned that the airport terminal is so busy. Maybe we could say something such as, the airport terminal is so busy right now. So the idea here is that you have to be able to use the words in a grammatically correct way that's appropriate to the picture. So kind of the final idea here is, yes, you could come up with longer sentences and perhaps more interesting ones, but really the idea here is you just have to meet the criteria. One sentence using both words in a grammatically correct way that's consistent with the photo. So at this point, that might be something to think about when you're ready to, take this part of the test.
So our final thoughts. Again, remember you have 8 minutes to complete all of the writing tasks in this part of the test. The picture, of course, is essential in determining the relevance of the response. It must describe what's important or essential to the picture, and it must focus on the now of the picture, including thinking about those appropriate grammatical forms. Now recall you're given 2 words under the picture, and you must use the picture to demonstrate how these words must be used. You must quickly identify the part of speech or function of the 2 words, and you must find a way to connect the words to each other to describe what is relevant about the picture. Grammatical appropriateness is the most important idea here. So again, remember, appropriateness can be defined by thinking about what's relevant and thinking about using the correct grammatical form. Again, thinking about maybe using the present progressive, using passive adjectives, or thinking about the right focus of the sentence. So for example, if you're using active voice versus passive voice. And remember, questions 4 and 5 will use a subordinating clause word. That's essential to understand, because in this case you must construct a more complex sentence. Now remember, word choice and usage. I think in this case we need to emphasize that using difficult or complicated vocabulary is not the focus. Really using appropriate word choice, that's the key. So we need to make sure we're choosing words that seem to be appropriate to the photo. And remember that the two words themselves can be flexible. You can use them in any combination or order as long as it's appropriate and relevant. Now, as you can see, throughout the entire video series, we've given lists of suggested materials. Obviously, ETS is probably, again, the best place to find information for these tests, because really the particular nature of a lot of these tasks are very specific. So again, I'm going to recommend that you purchase the Tactics for TOEIC textbook series by Grant True. This is published by Oxford University Press. The great thing about it is it includes actual examples from the test to really help you understand how the scoring system works. So again, I want to be clear here that what I am doing in this video series is basically demonstrating the information that ETS provides to us publicly. If you really want more practice, you really do need to think about purchasing the Tactics book. It's really great for helping you completely understand what the test is looking for. And of course, finally, we do have our TOEFL TOEIC preparation website, the link of which you can find at the bottom of this video. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time for the second video, Respond to a Written Text.